welcome friends. We have reached the last lecture in this course where we are now going to tell you some sustainable strategies that can be implemented in the transportation sector in order to make it environmentally viable, environmentally friendly and protect you from degenerating your health. What we are going to talk about in this are how to conduct environmental impact assessments for any transport related projects that is going on, give you highlights on what is the next step from environmental impact assessment, which is health impact assessment of any transport system, look into one of the externalities that are not talked about much, which is vehicular noise and how you can mitigate those, and then give you some strategies that will help reduce the emissions or help mitigate the environmental impacts of urban transport. So, environmental impact assessment is a tool that is required for any large project when it is implemented in India. So, this may be a non-transportation related project as well, but certainly any large highway projects, any highway widening projects which are beyond the threshold of a certain monetary number has to follow the norms and conduct environment impact assessment. You would see, however, that when it really comes to urban transportation projects which maybe are not of that large scale, EIA usually is not mandated, so they are not conducted. However, metro rail projects which are large enough, they have to go through this EIA process. So, we will tell you what this process is and make you aware that this is something that will help in reducing the environmental impacts of the transportation sector as a whole. So, this is a process which is a proactive process that can be implemented in order to understand what may be the negative or positive impacts on the environment as a result of an upcoming project or an existing transportation project that is in your city. So, what you usually have to do first is to or the local bodies or the implementing bodies first have to go through a screening or a scoping stage where they would actually try to see if an EIA is needed. Like I said, if the project is not of a magnitude that is going to impact a lot of people or is going to have a impact on a poor impact on the environment, then usually EIA is not conducted and only an environmental statement is given and the project is allowed to be constructed. However, if it is a large project and sometimes it is associated with funding as well, for example, if the funding agency mandates that any project to which, for example, World Bank provides any money, EIA is necessary for the implementing agency to perform. So, in screening and scoping, what they would see is decide whether the project has to go through an EIA or not. There are different criterias which they have to check and make sure that the project either falls or meets or does not meet those criteria. Once if it goes ahead and says that yes, EIA has to be conducted, then there has to be a baseline assessment. So, first what are the existing conditions have to be assessed, then after you establish the existing conditions or the baseline conditions, you have to assess the impacts of not only the alternative that is preferred for construction, but also at least one or two other alternatives, right. So, it is very important that when a project is being built, maybe the final alignment of a road or the alignment of a metro route is decided upon. However, when you are doing an environmental impact assessment, you have to also look at the impact that alternative designs might have. So, in other words, maybe the alternate design is expensive, but that should not be a reason for it to be considered or disregarded, because maybe maybe the expense is large, but maybe it is not impacting the environment in a poorer form. So, how can we then balance these two alternatives? So, it is always important to assess the impact of not only the preferred alternative, but also one or two other alternatives. Once you have identified the impacts, then you have to suggest mitigative or mitigative steps, right. It is not only good to just understand what the impacts or negative or positive impacts are, you have to also propose, and those proposed measures have to be implemented in order to mitigate the impacts of your transportation project. And once those are implemented, then you have to continuously monitor and evaluate it throughout the next couple of years, or at least throughout the operational period of that facility. So, these are the broadly the 5 steps that have to be followed in an environmental impact assessment. The same thing is shown in the form of a flow chart here. You see in the screening stage, if no EIA is required, then you can go ahead and proceed to develop the project, whereas an EIA is required, then you do your impact assessment, you give your mitigation steps. One of the interesting or the important things in this environmental impact assessment process is public involvement at multiple stages. So, you would see that public are often informed about a project at a very later stage, when everything is ready and the project is about to begin, and the affected people are only informed at the very last minute, which then causes a lot of litigations in the project, delay in the project, and cost escalation as a result of that. So, you have to always take into consideration the public, involve them in the project from a very early stage, and also involve them in later stages of the project, so that there is no delay in executing it, and they are already taken already taken into confidence. Now, EIA can be conducted at any of these stages: pre-construction, construction, or operation stages. So, for example, a road maybe has been there for the last 10 or 20 years, but you are seeing that there is growing pollution or growing poor environmental quality along that existing corridor. So, you may order one of the agencies to conduct an independent EIA to understand what the current impact of that road is, and can they suggest any mitigation measures which may reduce the environmental impact. So, it can be conducted at operational stage, but as you may understand, at an operational stage, any mitigation measures have to take into considerations the restrictions or the landlocked nature of the project, for example, and maybe large scale mitigation measures may not be possible. So, it is always recommended that EIA be conducted at a pre-construction stage, and then subsequently at other steps, at other stages also. What are assessed during EIA? The impact on hydrology and drainage is assessed, right, during the construction, and also after construction. A project may have a lot of impact on the adjoining water bodies, so that has to be mitigated. Obviously, the impact on land, what is happening to people residing alongside these projects, how the land, maybe it is now changing from the land use is changing from say an agricultural land to now becoming semi-residential or semi-industrial. So, what impact does that bring about to the environment? Noise is one of the impacts that we are going to look at. Flora and fauna, how the vegetation there and also the animals living in and around the project are going to be affected, birds, etc., are going to be affected by the project. What is going to happen to induced development and the existing human being or human life in that area? Are their quality of life is going to improve, deteriorate? What is going to happen? Do they need to be resettled? If so, where and how do you do that? If there are any cultural properties, historic heritage properties along the way of your project or at your project site, then how do you take care of that? Do you change the alignment of your project? Do you avoid such cultural sites? How do you do all that? What is the impact on such facilities as well? So, you see, when you are conducting an EIA, it has to be a very detailed report. An impact on various entities have to be taken into consideration, and mitigation steps for each one of these has to be identified and implemented in order to reduce the impact of a transportation project on the environment. Now, while EIA has been in place for a long time, but the next step in assessing the impacts of transportation projects is to look at how it impacts health, right. So, similar to an EIA process, the steps may be similar, but now, like we had mentioned in the earlier lecture, any transportation project will determine whether it is resulting in a decrease or an increase in pollutants in that area. So, based on that, impact assessments are being sought, or at least they are in a very early stage of understanding what the impact of for example, a large mall that is coming out in your suburban area, and there will be roads leading up to your up to the mall. So, what is that going to do to the air quality in otherwise purely residential suburban area? So, that is the kind of health impact assessments that is happening. This has to be a very multidisciplinary approach. Only transportation engineers or traffic engineers cannot conduct this. You need health experts. You need experts from even vehicular technology to understand all the impacts of all the impacts on health due to transportation. This is a kind of a flow chart that allows you to understand the big picture of how health impact assessment is done. So, if you know the current exposure, like we have told you in the earlier ones, if you know the current traffic injuries and fatalities, and also the current level of physical activity in people, right. If the transportation facility that is coming out there is going to help change their physical activity, are they going to make it more active? Is it going to make them less active? So, what impact will that going to have, right? So, all of this can be the input to your transportation improvement scenario as a result of the project that you are going to construct. You also know your vehicle kilometers of travel, existing vehicle kilometers of travel, and as a result of this improvement scenario, is it changing any fatalities per VKT? Is it reducing the actual number of VKT, actual amount of VKT? As a result, what is happening to your pollutants that are being emitted? Is the risk, is the mortality risk based on exposure to certain kinds reducing, and also does it impact the physical activity of the people? For example, if you are putting in a metro project, maybe a person who was now using their two-wheeler to go to work, maybe now would walk to the metro station and take metro to work, right. Now, by walking, he or she is improving his or her physical activity, or they are becoming more active. So, by becoming more active, your health is improving. So, that is the kind of impact assessment that that is being now sought for many of the transportation improvement projects. This is not taken off in very many countries yet, but it is at a research phase, but this is something that is very, very interesting and challenging. This is something that I have already talked about. There is a need for intersectoral cooperation. You have to be working with actual doctors and transportation engineers have to be working together in order to assess the impact or health impact of transportation improvement projects. Let us look at now one externality that usually we do not look at a whole lot, but in our Indian context, it is definitely something that we are always exposed to, which is vehicular noise. right. So, if you start looking at the scale of impact of the noise level, you would see that we are constantly listening to this, right. A car horn which is almost at a extremely loud level of 110 decibels or more, which is almost similar to an aircraft taking off. So, imagine how much of vehicular noise are we exposed to every day. So, what is that going to do? It may contribute to stress levels, maybe it will lead to subsequent effects of cardiovascular and immune system. Definitely is a cause of hearing loss. So, you would see that people who operate heavy machinery all the time, they use earplugs, otherwise they may be prone to hearing losses. So, the next time we are in a taxi or in our car, we should always make sure that we are not unnecessarily honking our horn. So, this is there is some vehicular noise that comes out because of the interaction of the tires and the road, but apart from that, the artificial noise that we bring about as a result of honking our horns for no real reason has to be really taken into account and really minimized. This chart gives you the noise limits which are not taking into consideration the honking of your horn, but this is just based on the noise that is generated between the tires and the surface of the road. Again, if you go, it has a relationship with the speed limit. So, if you start going faster and faster, the noise levels keep on increasing in case of motorcycles, passenger cars, buses, and any kind of heavy vehicles as well. So, that is the other also benefit of driving driving at or below the speed limit, so that not only you emit less, but you also create less noise, right. So, you would if you get into noise and transportation, you would see there is some research that is going on what is called as quiet pavements, right. Pavements that make less noise when coming in contact with your tires. So, how do you reduce these noise? Or you would look at newer highway projects that are going through a very congested neighborhood. They would build what is called sound walls on both sides of the highway, or even metro projects in some cases, right, because these sound walls are then going to shield the houses that are very close to the transportation project, so that the noise does not go into the houses beyond the stipulated limit. So, these are the ambient noise standards during daytime and night time, which should be followed, especially when a project or a metro rail or a highway project is very next to your house, because all these noise measurements are usually done 50 meter away from the center line of the transportation project. So as to assess its impact, not at exactly where it is generated, where the noise is generated, but how it dissipates at least 50 meters away from where it is generated. So, all these ambient noise standards have to be taken into account when you are talking about noise and transportation. Again, noise pollution, as we have already talked about, if it is anywhere up to 30 decibels, that does not create any disturbance. However, as you see, it goes as it starts increasing, it may have even long term impacts as well. Beyond just fatigue, it may lead to deafness, and definitely these are non auditory effects which have to be taken into consideration. So, the next time you are impacting or you are conducting impact assessment of any transportation projects, along with conducting environmental impact assessment, you have to make sure that there is some noise impact assessment that is also taken into consideration, and some mitigation measures are taken. Usually you would find such sound level meters which will give you an idea of what is the road noise that is coming out of a project. that is a handheld device gives you a gross level, gross decibel level at the road. But of course, if you have to know what each vehicle is emitting, then you have to use multiple equipment and understand the impact of different vehicles on the noise levels that are coming out. What are some of the mitigation measures or abatement measures? Raising, of course, noise awareness is something that we have to make people aware, or we have to be aware of that noise might create a problem and not just neglect it. Reception standards has to be put up, especially when the project is very close to you. Nighttime speed limits have to be really enforced, because if the noise ambient noise levels are increased or are heightened during the night time, that causes greater health impacts to us. Like I was saying, there is some surface design and maintenance issues. Traffic management has to be such that there is not a lot of people using their horns all the time. So there are different soft initiatives that can be done, different hard initiatives that can be implemented. But one thing that has to be done is to raise awareness about this, especially if you have vulnerable users such as children and elderly people living close to such noisy places. You have to be very careful about the exposure, about their exposure to high decibel levels. As we come to a close of this course, what I would like to make you aware of is the approach that is known as avoid, shift, improve. Right? This is an approach, a broad level approach that is being used by various urban local bodies or by various governments across the world in order to reduce the impact of transportation on not only environment and finally on its impact on climate, or its impact on climate change as well. So what it usually says is we have to avoid or reduce the use of personalized travel vehicles, right? Let us not unnecessarily travel on the roads. Let us not always use our personal vehicles for every other purpose. Let us shift, or let us create a scenario where we shift to alternate modes of transport. We use public transport a lot. We should use non-motorized modes of transport that will help mitigate the impacts, transport impacts on environment. And we have to improve at the same time. We have to improve the vehicle technology, the fuel technology that is available, maybe move towards renewable energy sources. So all the three things have to happen parallelly, right? Avoid, shift, and improve. Unless you do each of these things at the same time or parallelly, you may not see the complete benefits of mitigating the impacts of transportation on the environment. One example of this is to make a city compact, right? So when people are now as a part of smart cities, you will see that a lot of people are trying to make cities compact or develop zones such as transit oriented development, TOD zones around metro stations and so on and so forth. What they are trying to essentially do is to reduce the impact of, or one of the things that they are trying to do is to reduce the negative externality of transportation on the environment. So if you want to, for example, if your house and your shopping places are close to each other, so when you want to go from your home to your shopping complex, you would now only have to travel 2 kilometers versus if your shopping complex was too far and 10 kilometers away, then you had to choose a different kind of a mode. Then you decide that, okay, well, it is so close that I don't need to take out my car. Maybe I can just use my bicycle to go there. So even if you decide to take a car, maybe you then have an improved car, right? So this is the improved part of it. So maybe you have bought an electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle, or a vehicle with meets Bharat Stage 6 norms. So you have not only avoided going farther distance, you have now tried to shift to cleaner vehicles, and you have now tried to shift to alternate modes of transport, and also you have tried to improve your existing vehicle that you have. You have tried to have better vehicles that you own. So that is in a nutshell what this ASI strategy allows you to do. At a larger city level, if you want to see, land use planning obviously plays a very important role. Make land uses close to each other, which will allow you to have a compact city. And as we said in the first, in the A part of the approach, you are going to then avoid traveling for longer distances. Finally, shift. There are lots and lots of strategies that are being now implemented in urban areas in order to attract you to a public transportation mode or a non-motorized travel mode, right? You will see metro rail, you will see BRTS, you would see bicycle lanes that are coming out. You are seeing a lot of pedestrian improvements, sidewalks being laid out on all your streets. All of this is to encourage you to shift to different alternate transportation modes as compared to just using your private transportation mode. And finally, to improve to different types of vehicular modes, fuel technology, and so on and so forth. You are looking to reduce consumption, have technological innovations. Right now, you can even work from home. So teleworking is something that will reduce the impact of transportation on the environment. You can use an electric two-wheeler currently or a four-wheeler in order to reduce the impact. However, yes, we have to also at the same time move towards renewable energy sources in order to see the real benefits. So that is to have improve, or that is what we mean when we say to improve the scenario. So avoid, shift, improve is something we are always focusing on. This is something which I have already told you. What are some of the solutions? Have maybe pedestrian, how do you improve pedestrian facilities? We have talked in detail about this in our NMT section as well. Have proper zebra crossings, pedestrian signals, maybe improve the sidewalks that are there in your area, provide specialized facilities for non-motorized modes, do not improve the infrastructure, non-motorized infrastructure, provide better maintenance of non-motorized modes, make rapid transit attractive to people, let them see the real benefits of using public transportation, provide integrated ticketing so that they will allow they can use a simple smart card to buy fares on different types of public transportation that are available in the city. All of these strategies put together would help in attracting people to other modes of transport and help the emission reduction or help in reducing emissions of urban transport, right? You have already seen one such step that has been taken in New Delhi, where you say the Delhi government has usually applies this during the winter season, when it says that on a particular day only odd numbered registration plates, vehicles with odd numbered registration plates are allowed to ply on the Delhi roads, and the other day and the next day there will be even numbered even numbered vehicles. Similarly, you would see a lot of carpooling that is happening. Even the latest Ola and Uber transportation network companies encourage you to carpool so that your cost of traveling also goes down. But at the same time, now there are 4 people in a vehicle versus 4 people in 4 different vehicles that are emitting a much larger amount of emissions. So that carpooling also helps in reducing pollutants. So that brings us to the end of our course, not only the lecture but also the course. These are the last slide of references that you can use. I hope you have had an overview of what multimodal transportation is during the entire course. In this lecture, of course, we have exposed you to different types of environmental impact assessment, health impact assessment. How do you develop multiple strategies in order to avoid, shift and improve the existing scenarios in order to minimize the impact of transportation on the environment. So, I hope you have enjoyed this lecture and the entire course. Thank you very much for your attention.